For the last 2 centuries, America has run on immigration. Immigrants farmed and settled the West, immigrants worked in the factories of the East, and immigrants became Americans as they assimilated into American culture. However, America also runs on Americans complaining about immigrants. This tension between professing that the United States belongs to all people and being afraid that those new people will take your stuff resulted in a great deal of conflict in the 19th and 20th centuries. First, let's address the issue of why a person might want to come to the United States. When we talk about people moving, we break down motivations into 2 categories: push and pull factors. Push factors are things that push people out of their native places. In our case, immigrants were pushed out of Europe by several things. Racial, religious, political persecution was common throughout Europe. Any group that didn't fit in with a dominant group could find itself the victim of persecution, threats, and violence. Second, many European nations lacked economic opportunities for all their citizens. Many Italian immigrants especially moved to the United States with the intention of making money and then returning to Italy. Third, European countries had discovered the value in having a giant military and were conscripting many citizens against their will. The United States could be a haven to escape a draft. Finally, many places in Europe experienced harsh famines and natural disasters in the 19th century, the most famous being the Irish potato famine in 1845. This explains why an Irish farmer might want to leave his farm in Ireland. But to explain why he chose America, we need to examine pull factors. Pull factors are those incentives that encourage individuals to go to a place instead of just from. First, American industries were actively recruiting industrial workers. A shortage of labor had driven up wages, and businessmen were looking for workers who would be cheaper than Americans. Second, Congress was working with industry here to make this happen. The Contract Labor Act of 1864, another progressive development passed during the Civil War, promised to pay passage fees for immigrants who worked a set number of years in an American factory. Finally, many immigrants were unable to resist the pull of a new life, the ability to start over in a new country where nobody knew your name. Speaking of names, let's get something out of the way. Your name was not changed when your family came to Ellis Island. I don't care how many times your grandmother, your aunt, your uncle, your dad, your mom, whatever told you, hardly any names at all were changed at Ellis Island. This common misconception has no evidence to back it up. Immigration workers there did not even record the names of new arrivals. Instead, they checked them against what the private steamship companies had listed on their passenger manifests. If anything, there's far more evidence of workers fixing the mistakes of European shipping companies. So what was Ellis Island? Until 1954, Ellis Island was the central point in New York Harbor for European immigrants to arrive. Angel Island served the same purpose on the Pacific coast. Ellis Island was where the great big passenger liners would disgorge their passengers after several days on the Atlantic. 5,000 individuals per day could be processed at Ellis Island, although only the poor had to be processed at all. Think about the people in the really fun party scene in Titanic. The people on the top decks, your first and second class passengers, they could simply walk off the boat. For those less fortunate, a 29-question form had to be filled out. Name, height, age, sex, occupation, race, nationality all had to be determined before you could enter American soil. However, the form also asked if you had $50 in your pocket. Have you ever been in a mental asylum? Are you a secret anarchist? Why a secret anarchist would mark that on a form is anybody's guess, but they still had to check. So who were all these new arrivals? Well, the early 19th century saw mostly Northern and Western Europeans coming to the United States. Irish, Scotch, English, French, Germans all arrived in Ellis Island and went to different places. Boston, Baltimore, New York all became enclaves of Irish Americans. German Americans moved to the Great Triangle, the 3 cities of Milwaukee, St. Louis, and of course Cincinnati. Scandinavians moved to Minnesota since it looked more or less similar. However, after 1880, immigration shifted and new groups began arriving. New immigrants came from Eastern and Southern Europe, places like Italy, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, which was then part of Austria. There were Slovaks, Poles, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Russians. These groups were far different from the previous groups in terms of culture and language. They tended to live in enclaves surrounded by their own ethnicity, like Newport, Kentucky, which became the central point for Italians living in Cincinnati. However, even these offered little support against a prejudiced population. With no knowledge of American law, custom, or English, immigrants were easy prey for getting fleeced. Men who called themselves hiring agents could offer jobs for a finder's fee. This fee was then kicked back to the agent, keeping the immigrant in poverty and allowing the agent to wring his bread from the sweat of another man's brow. Those were the people willing to take advantage of newly arrived immigrants. Many Americans simply worked in order to exclude immigrants from even arriving in the United States. The Nativist movement was made up of Native Americans who saw immigrants as a threat to the culture and to their, altogether, gerbs. Because they assumed that Northern and Western Europeans were superior to Southern and Eastern Europeans, nativists were concerned that America would be taken over by different ethnic groups. You may have heard similar ideas today. Nativists based their arguments on the fact that many new immigrants appeared dumb and crime was rampant in immigrant enclaves. In fact, immigrants from Eastern Europe had far less experience with English than those from Ireland and Germany, and immigrant areas were rife with crime due to a lack of economic opportunity and no social support. What that means is that the very anti-immigrant attitudes were working to keep immigrants down and encouraging an ugly, vicious cycle. The most prominent anti-immigration group was the American Protective Association. Made up primarily of white Southern Protestants, the APA had a number of goals. First, they wanted to restrict legally the amount of immigrants that could enter the country. Based on nation of origin, because they didn't want to look racist, the United States established a system of quotas that favored North and Western Europe and limited anybody coming from a different place. The Chinese especially faced legal exclusion in the United States, and more on this in a second. The APA also worked for harder naturalization rules, making it more difficult for immigrants to become American citizens. This served the dual purpose of discouraging immigration from Europe and preventing immigrants from voting. The APA worked to discourage businesses especially to not hire Catholics or immigrants, many of whom were, in fact, the same groups. Finally, the APA demanded the use of an official language of the United States. Under the theory that everyone should, quote, speak English or get out, the APA rejected the offer of liberty to all humanity in favor of allowing in your tired, your poor, and your huddled masses yearning to be free as long as they could speak English. The APA was also obsessed with the ideas that Catholics would ruin America. In the 19th and 20th century, it was common Protestant knowledge that Catholics could not function in a democracy. Since they believed in the primacy of the Pope, it was feared that Catholics in America would simply vote for whatever the Pope wanted, not what was best for America. Indeed, in 1864, Pope Pius IX issued a papal encyclical named Quanta Cura, which attacked the new evils of communism, socialism, and democracy as antithetical to the Church and therefore antithetical to God. To protect America, nativists worked to exclude Catholics from attending public schools, afraid that introducing Catholicism would threaten the Protestantism that public schools taught. Thus, Catholic schools created their own system, which is, still around today. The rough economy of the 1890s offered fertile ground for nativists looking to blame someone for their lost jobs. In a move that would later be found in places like Nazi Germany and modern-day France, economic depression was explained by blaming new immigrants for taking all the jobs. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts worked tirelessly to pass legislation that banned any illiterate immigrant from entering the United States. Remember what we talked about yesterday with literacy tests, and you can probably figure out why this is a bad idea. 3 different presidents vetoed Lodge's proposed laws as being unconstitutional. Grover Cleveland in 1897, Taft in 1913, and Woodrow Wilson in 1915 and 1917. In 1917, Congress successfully overrode the president's veto, enacting harsh restrictions on immigration based on nation. More specific legislation was found in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Again, over the veto of President Chester Arthur, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first federal law to specifically limit the immigration of an entire race of people. Out of a fear that poor Chinese workers were, again, taking their jobs, Congress outlawed entirely all Chinese immigration for 10 years. With very little social support of Chinese immigrants already in the United States, there was little outcry. Chinese Americans were unlikely to speak English, weren't white, and very few were Christian. Lacking those 3 qualities meant that few people in the United States were willing to speak up for them. The Chinese Exclusion Act was consistently then renewed for 60 years, only being withdrawn as a law in the middle of World War II in 1943. Your activity for today is, with a partner of your choosing, make a short newscast on your iPads. In iMovie, put together a 30-second news piece as if you were an American in the 19th century. Establish who you are and how you believe that immigrants will affect you. What groups are you concerned about, and why? I'm looking for both thoughtfulness and historical accuracy, although I will be happy to see some good satire and irony as well. We'll take some time and watch these in class later this week. Hens and out.